The story of human history is not only about kings and empires, about weapons and wars, or about art and inventions. It is also about the most ordinary and yet most necessary part of life. To live is to eat, and to eat is to digest, and from digestion comes the inevitable question: where do we go when nature calls? We rarely think about it now, in our age of shining porcelain toilets and neatly wrapped rolls of paper, but for thousands of years our ancestors wrestled with this same need in ways that to us today may seem strange, shocking, or even hilarious. Yet hidden within those habits lies a mirror to the way humans lived, thought, and survived in different corners of the world. To understand our ancestors' toilet habits is to step closer to their daily lives, their fears, their ingenuity, and their culture. Imagine stepping back tens of thousands of years into the world of early humans. These were people who lived in caves, under the open sky, in forests and savannas where survival itself was a fragile thread. For them, relieving oneself was not a private, comfortable act but a dangerous gamble. Every movement, every moment in the open was a risk. Predators lurked in the dark, and the smell of human waste could attract them. Many tribes chose to bury their waste far away from camp, not because of hygiene as we think of it, but as a survival instinct, to mask their presence from lions, hyenas, or wolves. In some groups, there was almost a ritual to it. A designated spot, far from the sleeping ground, marked not for cleanliness but for safety. Imagine crouching in silence under the moonlight, ears straining for the sound of a twig snapping, because relieving yourself could mean becoming prey. That was the reality for our first ancestors. As humans moved into more complex societies, their toilet habits became just as complex and often quite bizarre. Travel to ancient Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. Here, some of the earliest toilets were constructed. Small pits lined with clay, connected to brick channels that carried waste away with water. But these were for the wealthy. Ordinary people simply used open spaces or rudimentary pits near their homes. Archaeologists have uncovered whole neighborhoods where waste was dumped into cesspits that overflowed into streets, the smell lingering like a constant companion of daily life. And yet, in temples dedicated to gods, priests used specially built latrines with drains, showing that the act of relieving oneself was already tied to ideas of purity and ritual. For them, defecation wasn't just biology, it had spiritual undertones. Now imagine walking through the grandeur of ancient Rome, a city with aqueducts that carried fresh water across miles, fountains that decorated plazas, and public baths where people gathered to wash and gossip. And yet, the Romans had some of the strangest toilet customs. Step into a Roman public latrine, and you would find long stone benches with keyhole-shaped holes carved into them, all lined up side by side. There were no walls, no stalls, no privacy. Dozens of people, men of all classes, sat shoulder to shoulder, robes lifted, chatting about politics, philosophy, or the latest gladiator fight while doing their business. Privacy was not part of the Roman mindset. In fact, for them, toilets were a place of community. But perhaps the strangest habit was their tool of hygiene, the sponge on a stick. Shared by everyone in the latrine, dipped in a bucket of water or vinegar between uses, this communal sponge replaced toilet paper. Imagine the awkwardness, the smell, and the risk of infection. Yet to Romans it was perfectly normal, even sophisticated. For them, what mattered was the flowing water that carried away waste into sewers like the mighty Cloaca Maxima, one of the earliest large sewer systems in the world. Travel further east to ancient China, where habits took on a different flavor. Here, archaeological evidence from thousands of years ago shows that toilets existed with bamboo pipes leading waste away. But more intriguing are the tools found near them. Flat sticks, sometimes carved from bamboo or wood, known as chugi. These were used to wipe, sometimes with cloth wrapped around, sometimes bare. Paper existed in China as early as the Han Dynasty, but it wasn't originally used for toilets. It was reserved for writing important texts. Using it for waste was seen as wasteful itself. In fact, it was only centuries later that toilet paper became common in China, while the rest of the world wouldn't adopt it until much, much later. Before that, people relied on water, leaves, stones, or sticks. The idea of soft paper for such a purpose would have seemed luxurious, even laughable, to most ancestors. But if we look at medieval Europe, we find another bizarre world. Castles, with their towering walls and majestic halls, often had garderobes, toilets built into the outer walls of the fortress. These were essentially wooden seats above a vertical shaft that dropped waste straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes onto the open ground. Imagine a knight in shining armor walking below, only to be surprised by what came falling from above. In fact, the word garderobe itself suggests another strange habit. People used to hang their clothes in these toilet chambers, believing that the strong smell would repel moths and insects. The place where waste gathered was also the place to protect precious garments. Hygiene, as we understand it, was not part of medieval thinking. For peasants, the habits were even simpler and stranger. Chamber pots were kept under beds, often shared by the whole family, then emptied out of windows onto the street below. The phrase "watch out below" was not a joke, it was a survival warning for anyone walking in narrow city alleys. Across the world, in Japan, toilet customs took yet another turn. In early times, human waste wasn't just something to get rid of, it was a valuable resource. Farmers collected it, known as night soil, to fertilize their fields. In fact, in some areas people paid for the right to collect waste from households. The idea that excrement could be part of the cycle of life, turning into rice and vegetables, was deeply ingrained. But the act of relieving oneself was not always simple. Some toilets were built directly over rivers or streams, where the flow of water carried waste away. Yet accidents were common. There are even folk tales of river creatures pulling down unsuspecting people from toilet seats built over water, a reflection of the very real fear of falling into a dangerous stream while in such a vulnerable position. Even stranger customs appear if we look at the ancient Mayans. In their sacred cities, waste was often buried or ritually burned. In some cultures of the Americas, defecation was linked to spiritual cleansing, the body ridding itself of impurities not just physically but spiritually. For them, it could be a private ritual act. And in some indigenous tribes across the world, relieving oneself was associated with taboos. People avoided going near water sources, not just for hygiene but because rivers and lakes were seen as the homes of spirits. To defile them with waste was to anger powerful forces. As centuries rolled on, toilet habits reflected not just survival but class. In Victorian England, the wealthy began to embrace the invention of the flush toilet. But before that, the poor in crowded cities relied on cesspits that overflowed, or nightmen, who carried buckets of waste through the streets at night to dump them elsewhere. The smell of entire neighborhoods was overwhelming. Diseases like cholera spread rapidly because waste seeped into drinking water. People were living side by side with their own excrement, and the connection between waste and illness was only slowly understood. Until then, even in great cities, toilet habits were chaotic and deadly. Looking back at all these customs, it's easy to laugh or grimace at the strangeness of it all. The communal sponge of Rome, the garderobes of castles, the bamboo sticks of China, the chamber pots tossed into the streets of Europe. Yet behind the strangeness lies a truth. Every society found its own way to deal with a universal need, shaped by its environment, resources, and beliefs. To them, these habits were not weird, they were simply life. What feels odd to us today was ordinary to them, just as our gleaming toilets and scented paper might seem bizarre, even wasteful to someone from centuries past. But perhaps the weirdest realization of all is that toilets are more than just practical tools. They reveal how people thought about privacy, about community, about purity, and even about the relationship between humans and the natural world. To squat in silence under the stars, to share a sponge with strangers, to empty a pot into the street, or to build a toilet over a rushing stream. Each habit tells a story of survival, culture, and human imagination. And so, when we flush away our waste today with a simple push of a button, we are not just enjoying convenience, we are standing at the end of a long, strange, and fascinating history. A history of habits that might make us laugh or shiver, but that also reminds us of the endless creativity and adaptability of our ancestors. For in every age and in every land, humans found a way. And often, that way was as weird as it was wonderful.